IPR. The Institute was a non-governmental organization that was founded in 1925 and that collapsed in 1961. During its lifetime it held a series of biennial conferences, published a journal called Pacific Affairs, and produced a large number of books and pamphlets related to problems of the Pacific Basin. As you said, my interest in the IPR began in the early 1980s as part of my research on another group, the Round Table Movement.
It's my understanding that the Round Table Movement was a political pressure group based in London that called for federation of the British Empire. How did your study of the Round Table turn into research on the IPR?
It's a complicated story, really. A little earlier in 1980 I had read a short but inflammatory book called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, which warned of forces that were conspiring to create a one-world socialist government. That book had briefly mentioned the Institute as being part of this conspiracy, calling it a front organization for international communism.
That's a rather sweeping indictment.
Yes, but I was inclined to accept the book's accusation at face value. However, I wasn't content to let the matter rest there. I wanted to look at the sources used by the authors of None Dare Call It Conspiracy to learn more.
And what were their sources?
Their main source was a Georgetown University professor named Carol Quigley, who had written a book called Tragedy and Hope. I was able to find a copy of that book, and it was there that I read Quigley's assertions that the Institute of Pacific Relations had been both a communist front and a round table front.
But that didn't satisfy you either.
It did for a time. The trouble with Tragedy and Hope was that there was no documentation to back up what Quigley had argued. I really had to take Quigley's word for whatever he said, and that bothered me. So I started looking for more sources dealing with the Round Table Movement and the Institute of Pacific Relations.
What kind of information were you looking for?
I was looking for evidence that supported what I already believed to be fact. I thought it was a fact that the IPR was a communist front and that it had been controlled by the Round Table. I really wasn't looking to change my mind about the Institute.
So what happened?
I decided to find every source I could, from the Institute's founding until its fall in 1961. I was in college at the time, so I spent a lot of time in the periodicals room of the library, where I went through every issue of the American and international periodical indexes to find articles about the Institute. To my surprise, I found a large amount of information, which I copied and then used to write a kind of report on the IPR.
Did you reach any conclusions?
I did decide that Professor Quigley had gone too far in his characterization of the Institute. There was no conclusive proof that it had been either a round table front or a communist front. But I still found it to be an interesting group, and I did think it deserved some of the criticism that it received in the 1950s.
Let's go back to the beginning of IPR history and start from there. What exactly was the Institute?
The origins of the Institute go back to 1919, just after the end of World War I, when the Young Men's Christian Association developed the idea of holding a conference or a series of meetings to discuss international tensions in the Pacific region.
You mean the YMCA?
That's right. It was a slow process, but finally in July 1925 they helped to sponsor the first conference, which was held in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Who were the attendees of this conference?
The organizer was a man named Frank Atherton, who was a Hawaii businessman. Most of the other attendees were YMCA delegates, labor leaders, journalists, academic leaders, and so on, and they represented most of the countries that either bordered or had territory in the Pacific.
Any communists?
Not that I'm aware of. The Soviet Union was not represented, and it didn't join the IPR until 1933.
How about Round Table members?
I was surprised to learn that only one or possibly two Round Table members were at the opening conference. To be honest, I'm not certain that the people I'm thinking of were members. Certainly none of the members of the main Round Table group in London attended, and there was no mention made of the conference in the Round Table Journal.
So what happened at the first meeting?
They made two major decisions, the first being to hold a second conference in 2 years. They also decided to create a permanent organization that they called the Institute of Pacific Relations, the purpose of which was to study the social, economic, and political conditions of the Pacific so that the various nations and territories of the region could coexist amicably.
So the YMCA held the conference, and what happened after that?
Once the Institute had been established, the influence of the YMCA diminished very quickly, especially its religious missionary influence. The IPR wanted to establish itself as a scholarly and research institution that would use scientific research to lower tensions that might lead to war. Their other main focus was to organize the Institute, and the path they chose was quite interesting.
How so?
Instead of having a single, monolithic organization, they created a federal structure that reflected the fact that members came from different countries. So, for example, they created an American council, an Australian council, a Japanese council, a Chinese council, and so on. Each member state had its own national council. And what made it even more interesting was that often a pre-existing organization became the national council of its respective country.
I see what you mean. What organizations were chosen to become national councils?
For the British Commonwealth countries, the National Council was the local Institute of International Affairs, which in turn were offshoots of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. These institutes of international affairs were usually dominated by Round Table members, and that is how the Round Table was able to gain entry into the affairs of the Institute of Pacific Relations.
What about in the United States? The Council on Foreign Relations is usually thought of as being a relative of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, especially in its early years.
The pattern was different in the US because the American Council was formed as its own organization. The CFR did not become the National Council, though they did have some overlapping membership. That arrangement probably helped to save the Council on Foreign Relations from sharing the same fate that later befell the Institute.
So the Institute of Pacific Relations was a kind of federal body that was composed of national councils.
Yes, and it was governed by a small committee called the Pacific Council, which had the leader of each national council on the committee. From 1927 until about 1935, the Commonwealth leaders were almost always Round Table members.
What did the Pacific Council do to run the Institute?
It planned future conferences, it created a research secretariat to generate data for the conferences, and it directed Institute publications. By the late 1920s, they had begun publishing a quarterly journal for the IPR, which was called Pacific Affairs.
Tell me more about these conferences.
They were the most public element of the Institute, and they were held like clockwork every 2 years. In 1927, they held another one in Honolulu, then they had one in Kyoto, they had one in Banff, Canada, and so on. They were very well publicized events with hundreds of participants who included journalists, writers, Asia scholars, labor leaders, and so on. They even held conferences during World War II, though without the participation of a Japanese delegation, of course. After the war, they were even held in Pakistan, which is rather far from the Pacific.
Was this such an unusual practice? I would think most organizations would welcome publicity.
Usually they do, but the Institute was much more public than the other groups I have studied. The Council on Foreign Relations, for example, had extremely few articles written about it in the American press. Up until the 1980s or so, they were very rare, and CFR meetings were always private. Only within the last decade or so has the Council begun to have more of a public image.
And that willingness to be publicized aided your research?
Oh yes, immensely. It's true that popular articles about the Institute declined in number in the 1930s and 1940s, but there was still a great deal of information available. In the 1950s, however, there was a vast number of articles to go through, most of which discussed the Institute's ties to communism.
Let's pause for a moment, and then we'll talk about the Institute of Pacific Relations and the controversy about its communist connections.